kept the same face for 40 years. Neighbors waved at him. He waved back. Somewhere in that ordinary face was a secret so violent it would take the entire arc of modern forensic science, from blood typing to DNA banking to strangers uploading their spit to genealogy websites for fun, to finally drag it into the light. For 4 decades, a man walked through Sacramento wearing his freedom like a coat he never once had to explain. And the woman he took it from never got the chance to grow old at all. This is the story of a killer who almost got away with it forever, and the piece of himself he left behind on a bedroom wall that outlived his silence. Stay with me, because what finally caught him wasn't a confession, wasn't a witness, wasn't even a detective's gut instinct. It was a stranger who had never met him, never heard of him, never done anything wrong at all, except take a DNA test to find out where her ancestors came from. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up thinking about how close monsters can live to ordinary lives, hit subscribe now, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. It helps this channel more than you know, and it means when the next case like this drops, you won't miss it. Now stay with me to the end, because the way this one gets solved is stranger than anything you'd expect. Because somewhere in the middle of this story, there's a moment where investigators have everything. A full genetic fingerprint, a face generated from DNA alone, and still can't put a name to it. That's not where the story ends. That's barely the middle. Let's go back to where it started. Sacramento, California. Late 1979. A 20-year-old woman named Robin Brooks got off a plane 3,000 miles from where she'd grown up. She wasn't running from anything dramatic. She was running towards something ordinary. Her sister lived here, and Robin wanted to be closer to family. That was the whole plan. Start over. Be near people who loved her. She found an apartment in a complex off Kaffir Boulevard in the Rosemont area. She found a job a short walk away at a donut shop that stayed open into the early morning hours. She didn't own a car. She didn't need one. Her entire new life fit inside a few blocks. Apartment, sidewalk, counter, register, sidewalk, apartment. A loop she probably could have walked with her eyes closed within a few weeks. By April of 1980, she'd been living that loop for about 6 weeks. Long enough to know her coworkers. Long enough to have a routine. Not long enough to know that one of those routine nights would be her last. On the night of April 23rd, she clocked in for her shift like always. She talked to a coworker about something completely unremarkable, laundry. She'd just washed her bed sheets and would have to remake the bed when she got home. It's the kind of sentence that means nothing when you say it. Nobody remembers throwaway conversations about bed sheets. Except somebody should have remembered that one. Because Robin never got the chance to remake that bed. Just after midnight, her shift ended. She started the walk home. 1 block. A walk she'd made dozens of times. She never made it to morning. When she didn't show up for her next shift, coworkers went to check on her. What they found inside that apartment was the kind of scene that stays lodged behind a person's eyes for the rest of their life. Robin was on her bed, a waterbed, the kind that was everywhere in 1980, and the mattress had been torn open during the attack. Water and blood had mixed and spread across the floor. The room had been torn apart. She had been assaulted. She had been stabbed 5 times. 1 wound went straight through her heart. But here's the detail that the killer couldn't have known would matter. Not that night, and not for another 40 years. Robin fought. Hard. At some point in that struggle, her attacker's own hand slipped down the blade of the knife he was using. He cut himself. And in the chaos of trying to kill her and trying to leave, he left smears of his own blood across her bedroom wall. Blood that had never belonged to Robin at all. He also left fingerprints, pressed into the windowsill, the exact spot where he'd climbed in, and the exact spot where he climbed back out. And here's what should have been the first alarm bell for investigators. Nothing was missing. No jewelry gone. No cash taken. Nothing about the apartment suggested a robbery that spiraled out of control. This wasn't opportunism. This was something colder and far more targeted. A 20-year-old woman, 6 weeks into a brand new life, killed by someone who, as far as anyone could tell, she had never met before. Detectives in 1980 had one real tool at their disposal for biological evidence: blood typing. It could sort people into broad categories: A, B, AB, O, shared by millions of people. It could rule someone out. It could never single anyone in. Think about that for a second. Investigators stood in that bedroom, looking at blood that didn't belong to the victim, blood the killer had left behind himself, without meaning to, and they had absolutely no way to turn it into a name. It was like holding a photograph of someone's face with the features blurred out. You could tell it was a person. You couldn't tell who. So they did the only thing 1980s policing could do with evidence like that. They went back to basics. Who knew Robin? Who had access to her apartment? Who had a reason, however thin, to be standing on the other side of that door? They tried anyway. They pulled blood samples from people close to Robin's life, including a man dating her sister, who became an early person of interest simply because he had access, a connection, a reason to be questioned. His blood didn't match. Neither did anyone else's. The family posted a $10,000 reward, enormous money in 1980, and tips flooded in. Every single one of them led nowhere. No eyewitness ever came forward. No one had heard a scream, or if they had, no one connected it to anything. The case sat there, unsolved, until it did what unsolved cases do. It went cold. Filed. Not forgotten by the people who loved Robin. Never that. But quietly moved to the back of a drawer that mostly stopped getting opened. But that's not even the worst part of what happened next. Because for the next 24 years, that drawer sat there, and so did something else. In a climate-controlled evidence room, samples from that bedroom wall were carefully preserved. Nobody in 1980 had the technology to read what was inside that blood. But somebody made the decision to keep it anyway, to not let it degrade, to not throw it away. That single administrative decision, made by people whose names history didn't bother to record, would end up being the only reason this case was ever solvable at all. Think about how easily it could have gone the other way. Evidence rooms fill up. Budgets get cut. Old boxes get flagged for disposal to make room for new ones. Somewhere in the paperwork of a police department that had thousands of open cases and finite shelf space, somebody had to decide that a 40-year-old sample of dried blood from an unsolved homicide was worth keeping. Not because they knew what it would become. They couldn't have known. DNA phenotyping didn't exist yet. Investigative genetic genealogy wasn't even a concept anyone had put into words. They just followed a rule that said, don't throw this away. That's the quiet, unglamorous truth sitting underneath almost every modern cold case breakthrough. It isn't a genius detective having a flash of insight 20 years too late. It's a filing decision made by someone who will never get their name in a headline, multiplied by decades of patience, multiplied by science that hadn't been invented yet. Meanwhile, Phillip Lee Wilson lived his life. He went to work. He came home. He got older, the way everyone does, the way that feels ordinary from the inside and invisible from the outside. Somewhere in that ordinary life, did he ever think about that night? Did he assume, the way so many of them do, that time itself was a kind of alibi, that if enough years passed without a knock on the door was never coming? For 24 years, he would have been right. In 2004, Sacramento's cold case unit started working back through decades-old homicide files. Robin Brooks' case came back into the light. And this time, the science had caught up. Technicians were able to pull a clean, single-source male DNA profile from the preserved evidence, a full genetic fingerprint belonging to one person and one person only. They ran it through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, built from the profiles of convicted offenders across the country. If this man had ever been arrested for a serious enough crime anywhere in America, this was the moment his name would surface. Nothing came back. Whoever he was, he had never been convicted of anything that put his DNA in that system. He'd been careful, or lucky, or both. For most cold cases, this is the wall nobody gets past. A perfect DNA profile with no name attached to it is its own kind of dead end, proof of a monster's exact genetic signature, and still no way to knock on his door. But this is where things take a turn nobody in 1980 could have predicted, because the science wasn't finished evolving. And the next breakthrough wouldn't come from a criminal database at all. It would come from ordinary people. People who had never committed a crime in their lives. People spitting into plastic tubes and mailing them off to find out if they were secretly Irish. In 2017, investigators partnered with a lab specializing in something still controversial at the time, DNA phenotyping. Using nothing but the genetic material recovered from that bedroom wall, geneticists built a predictive composite, an estimate of what the killer probably looked like, based purely on the physical traits encoded in his own DNA. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't a police sketch built from a witness's memory. It was a face pulled out of molecules that had been sitting in storage since before most people watching this today were even born. The composite went public. Local news picked up the story. And for a moment, it felt like the case might finally break open. It didn't. A predictive composite is a probability, not an identity. It could narrow a search. It couldn't hand anyone a name. Here's what makes that composite so strange to sit with, looking back. Somewhere out there, in 2017, the actual man that face was modeled on could have scrolled past a news segment about his own crime, looking at a synthetic rendering of his own bone structure, his own eye color, his own likely skin tone, a face built entirely out of molecules he left behind without meaning to, and had no idea he was looking in a mirror. Or maybe he never saw it at all. Maybe he just kept living the next block over, the next town over, however far 2 miles felt after 40 years. That would take one more leap, and it would arrive just 3 years later, from a completely different direction. If you're new here, this is usually the part of these cases where people give up hope. Don't. Because what happened next is the reason this case is even worth telling. Stick around. We're just getting into the part that changes everything. By 2020, a method called investigative genetic genealogy had quietly started cracking cold cases across the entire country. Here's the idea, stripped down to its simplest form. Instead of looking for an exact match in a criminal database, you compare crime scene DNA against millions of profiles voluntarily uploaded by ordinary people trying to build their family trees. You're not looking for the killer's own DNA sitting in a database, because it isn't there. You're looking for his second cousins, his third cousins, people who have never heard his name, who have no idea they're related to him, who uploaded their own spit for completely unrelated reasons, and who, without knowing it, just handed investigators a map to his front door. A genetic genealogist took the high-resolution profile from Robin's case and uploaded it to genealogy databases. What came back wasn't a suspect. It was a scattering of distant relatives, genetic echoes of people who shared branches of a family tree with a man nobody could yet name. From there, the work stopped looking like forensic science and started looking like archival detective work. Public records, old obituaries, historical directories. Piece by piece, generation by generation, the family tree narrowed. Branches got cut. Names got crossed off. And all of it converged on one man. A man who had been living in Sacramento in 1980, at the exact time Robin Brooks was murdered. For the first time in 40 years, the DNA sitting in that evidence room finally had a name attached to it. But a name isn't proof. Before anyone could make an arrest, they needed absolute certainty. And they needed to get it without tipping him off, without giving him a single chance to run, to destroy evidence, or to simply disappear. So they watched him, quietly, from a distance. For weeks, investigators studied his daily movements without ever approaching him directly. And then they did something almost anticlimactic, something that sounds too mundane to be the hinge point of a 40-year murder investigation. They went through his garbage. It's a technique that's become standard in modern genealogy cases. Anything a person voluntarily throws away is considered abandoned property. No warrant required. Investigators pulled items from his trash, items carrying his DNA, and sent them for comparison against the evidence from 1980. The result wasn't close. It wasn't a partial match or a consistent with. It was a complete, unambiguous match between his discarded DNA and the blood left on Robin's bedroom wall 40 years earlier. And when they compared his fingerprints against the ones lifted off that windowsill in 1980, those matched too. Two separate forensic markers. One man. No room left for doubt. His name was Phillip Lee Wilson. In April of 1980, he had been 31 years old, living less than 2 miles from Robin's apartment. Public records showed no relationship between them at all. No shared friends, no history, nothing to explain why their paths would ever have crossed. As far as anyone could determine, he was a total stranger to her. And then he simply kept living. For 40 years, in the same general area, under the same name, invisible not because he was hiding, but because nobody was looking. A neighbor, a resident, a man doing errands, paying bills, growing old. While the answer to a question an entire county had been asking since 1980 sat quietly inside him the whole time. On April 24, 2020, 40 years to the day after Robin's body was found, Detectives moved in on a residence in North Sacramento and arrested 71-year-old Phillip Lee Wilson. Nobody planned that date. It just landed there, a symmetry nobody could have engineered, the kind of coincidence that feels almost too clean to be real, and yet somehow always seems to happen in cases like this. He was booked on first-degree murder with special circumstances. The lead detective who had reopened this case back in 2004 and stayed with it for 16 more years had finally reached the moment she'd spent a career chasing. But an arrest is not a conviction. Wilson's defense team had a strategy waiting, and it would take nearly 2 more years and 1 deadlocked jury before this case reached its end. The trial began in early 2022. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and devastating. Wilson entered Robin's apartment through that window, assaulted her, and then killed her, not in a blind panic, but as a calculated act to remove the only person who could ever identify him. The defense took a different road entirely. They didn't dispute the DNA. By 2022, that would have been almost impossible. Instead, they argued the sexual contact had been consensual and pointed back at the same man investigators had questioned decades earlier, suggesting he was the real killer after all. For a moment, it worked. On March 8, 2022, the jury came back deadlocked, split down the middle. Some jurors said they weren't sure exactly how the struggle had unfolded or how the attacker had entered. But here's what's almost impossible to explain away with a story about a consensual encounter. Nobody climbs through a window to see someone who would have simply opened the door for them. And nobody's blood ends up smeared across the walls of a room during a struggle that was supposedly welcome. The jury went back into deliberation. They looked again at the fingerprints on the windowsill. They looked again at the blood on the wall. His blood, mixed with hers, in a room where nothing had been consensual at all. Picture that room for the jury, laid out across weeks of testimony. A torn waterbed. A ransacked bedroom that held nothing missing. A window used as a door. A knife that cut its own owner mid-attack. Every piece of physical evidence told the same story, and none of it matched a version of events where 2 people had simply been together and something afterward went wrong. Consensual encounters don't usually end with the guest's blood smeared across the wall during what the defense wanted the jury to believe was a quiet, private moment. It's the kind of gap between a story and its evidence that a jury can only stare at for so long before it collapses under its own weight. On March 9, 2022, Phillip Lee Wilson's 73rd birthday, the jury came back unanimous. Guilty. 6 weeks later, a judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 42 years after he climbed through a window and ended a 20-year-old woman's life, the case that had sat frozen in an evidence locker for decades had finally, completely, closed. For the people who carried this case the longest, the verdict wasn't just a legal outcome. It was the end of something that had stayed open, raw, and unresolved for more than 4 decades. Robin's sister sat through the entire trial. She had lived with this case, shaping a piece of who she was since she was young enough that it should never have had to. When it was finally over, she talked about being able to move forward for the first time, and about what it meant for other families still waiting on their own cold cases. Proof that time doesn't automatically protect the people who think they've gotten away with something. And that's the part of this story that should actually unsettle you. Phillip Lee Wilson didn't get caught because he made a mistake in 2020. He got caught because of a decision made in 1980 by people who chose to preserve a bloodstain on a wall instead of letting it disappear. And he got caught because, decades later, complete strangers, people who had never heard of him, who would never even find out they helped, decided to spit into a tube to find out where their great-grandparents were from. If a single smear of blood on a bedroom wall was enough to end this, after 42 years, after every database search came back empty, after a full genetic composite still couldn't produce a name, you have to wonder how many other men are living exactly this life right now. Ordinary, unremarkable, walking past their own neighbors every single day, completely unaware that somewhere out there, a distant cousin they've never met just took an ancestry test for fun, and that the walls are already starting to close in. There's something almost unbearably quiet about how this kind of justice actually arrives. No dramatic chase. No last-minute confession under bright interrogation lights. Just a man taking out his own trash on an ordinary Tuesday, having no idea that the choice not to shred a receipt or rinse a cup was the last mistake in a 40-year streak of getting away with it. He'd already survived the blood typing era. He'd already survived the birth of CODIS. He'd already survived the national database search that came back empty in 2004. He almost survived genealogy too, right up until a family tree built out of people who never knew him closed in around the one branch that did. For 42 years, Robin Brooks was a name in a cold case file. A daughter, a sister, a 20-year-old who moved 3,000 miles to start a new life and got 6 weeks of it. Somewhere in Sacramento, for 4 of those decades, the person responsible for ending her story kept living his. Uninterrupted, unremarkable, unafraid. And the only reason that changed is that science eventually caught up to what he thought he'd buried for good. If this case got under your skin, make sure you're subscribed and that notifications are turned on, because I'm covering cases exactly like this one every week. Cases where the only reason a killer was ever found was a relative who had no idea they were helping. And if you want to go deeper into cases like this one, the link in the description takes you into our community. Because somewhere tonight, another one of these files is sitting in another evidence locker, waiting, the same way this one did, for 42 years, for someone, somewhere, to finally take a test they thought had nothing to do with anyone but themselves.